Hi guys, welcome back to Coding World. Today in this video we are going to start one new series which is a Spring Boot cloud. So in Spring Boot cloud there are many components and we are going to see those one by one. In this first video I am going to show you about a Spring Cloud config server. And for that we are going to create a one simple microservice. Then we are going to do the setup of the Spring Cloud config server, and we are creating a local repository, Git repository, and we are having configuration in our Git repository. In simple microservice, first I will show how to read the configuration from our application property file, and then we are calling a Spring Boot Cloud config server. In Spring Boot Cloud config server, first we will store those configuration in a file, which is our application file, and then we replace this part with a Git config repository. So in Git repository, we will be having a project specific folder, and in that folder, we will be keeping our .property files. And from that .property files, we will read values into our Spring config server, and from Spring config server, we will bring those back into our microservices. So this is going to interesting tutorial for the Spring Boot lover, and please watch this video till end. So let's get started. So our first step is to create a simple microservice. In this microservice, we are going to create a one controller which will return your authentication. It will return authentication URL for the applications such as a Slack, Zoom, Facebook. So these three applications we are going to considering. So let's create a Spring project by configuring the necessary dependency. So first one is I'm keeping coding word auth demo, and I am selecting packaging service as a jar and Java as a element. So this is a main part where we are selecting the dependencies. I am selecting a Spring Web, then Dev Tools I am selecting for the speedy development, and then Acquitator, and this is a main one, config client. So once you configure these four major dependency, you are ready to the your initial Spring Boot service. So I have configured this, and let's generate the zip file of this project and import it into your favorite editor. So this is my project auth demo, and I have successfully imported that into my IntelliJ. So let's create our first bean, which will be used for our configuration, and that is a log detail, login detail. Okay, in login detail, we can create auth URL and login URL. Those values we will be configured first in our application.property files, and then we fetch that from the config server. So let's create a first simple bin file, then we will create a controller, and we run the application and show on our browser. So this is our simple login detail class, and here we are configuring login URL and auth URL. Login URL means your login application login URL, and authorization URL means the URL which will be required for authorization. So first we will configure this from our static values, and then we get that from the config server. Let's create a controller. Return new login details. So where I am initially providing the two URL, one is the login URL and second is auth URL. Facebook auth URL is this and Facebook login URL is instead of this we to login. Okay, and we have to pass this value. So we are done with our first controller, which is a login detail. And let's run this application and check we are able to get the login details or not. Application has been started successfully on 8080. Let's hit our login URL. If we are not currently we are not configuring the cloud config, hence I have disabled that. Okay, and when we create our config server, then we will set the config server detail here in application.property files. Let's hit our localhost URL, login detail, and we are able to get the login URL and auth URL successfully. Now next step is to fetch this value from our property files. So let's create a two properties, login URL and auth URL. Before that, I am mentioning my project name. So it will be easy if in future we move this property to common file where all the properties of all projects has been mentioned. So it's very useful to mention the property name like this. Yeah. Now create a config server, config class, and from config class, we will fetch this property and set into our login detail. So let's create the config class. This is our configuration and configuration property. Auth demo. And from auth demo, we have to mention the string as it is. This is our configuration class where we have login URL, auth URL, and we are annotated this class with the configuration properties and configuration. Keep in mind that this is the first value from our property, which is auth demo, and all the fields from within this class are login URL and auth URL. These should be the same as your property name because it will automatically inject those values here. Now we have to fetch the values from configuration and put into our login detail. Let's generate a getter setter. Okay, and I am import auto hiring this value into our controller class. This is for demo, that's why I am not creating separate class, service class, and then calling everything, because here main focus is on our concept. So configs, and from config I will get the login URL and auth URL. I am removing these changes. Done. We are ready with our properties. Let's rerun our application, check that we are fetching those value from our application property file. So application has been successfully started on our 8080. Let's hit this URL, login detail URL, and check all values are coming from our application property file. Let me refresh it. Okay, so it's giving all value, login URL and auth URL from our property files. We are done with our first part to reading the configuration from the property file. So let's create our config server and fetch those value from the config server. So our next step is to create a config server. For that config server, we have to configure two dependencies. One is our Spring Web, then Spring Dev Tool. I am adding that for my development. Acquitator is no needed. And instead of config client, we will add a config server. Okay, and here artifact will be my Spring Cloud config server. Once this has been done, we need to generate the zip file of this Spring sample project and import into your favorite IntelliJ and import it into your favorite editor. So finally, I have opened that into our IntelliJ, which is a Spring Cloud config server, and I have run that. Before run, we have to configure two properties, which is a server.port 18088 and one more annotation we have to add, that is enable config server. We have successfully configured our Spring Cloud config server, but for that we need to a Git repository where we are storing our property files. So for that we have to create a first local Git repository, and in that we have to paste our property files with the prefix as your project name. I have created Git local config repository on my local system, and I need to create a, currently there is nothing in this local repository. I will paste two property files from our login project, which will be having a QA properties and dev properties, and according to profile we will be fetching those in our project. So let's copy those property files and paste it here. So I have copied all my property files from auth demo into your Git local repository, and one is for the default, which will be having no profile value, and one will be a for profile QA. So let's, if I want to show you what is in that. Okay, so we have auth demo login URL, auth demo, auth URL. So we will read this property file in your cloud config server. So these two properties are more important because one is a for the branch name and this is a for our, this is location where I have put my all Git repository. So this is a location where I have created my local Git repository, and in that repository we have stored two files. One is for QA, one is for the default. So let's run this application and check which property we are able to see. Okay, so Tomcat has been started on successfully on 8088. I will give auth demo. This is my project name, and we'll check for the default, this one. So we are able to get the default properties for our auth demo. Let's check for the QA environment. For QA, it is showing we are loading data from the QA properties. But if you observe that I am not able to see the my two properties, one is login URL and one is auth URL in this property. So for that we need to check. So you have seen that we are not able to get the properties for QA and default domain. There is a small issue in our in your Git repository. We have added those files. If you check, these two files was previously for my demo purpose. I have deleted, and these two files I have created, but I have not added those files into our Git repository. So let me add it. So I'm clearing this. This is a locally I have committed. Now we will restart our application config server, and it should start populating there. These are the small issues you face while you are developing this application. So better it's always better to have multiple problems while developing an application, so you will able to understand how exactly it works. Okay, so let's refresh it and check. Yes, we are able to successfully load the configuration for the our QA environment, and you can able to see the resources also, and auth login URL, auth auth URL. These are the information. So we are getting all these configuration on our config server. Now we have to set our cloud config servers into our cloud config client, because when we hit this, we will get the information, get the property files and all cloud configuration for our cloud configuration server. So let's do the changes in our auth login service. So this is my auth demo. In this, I am going to remove this all things. So this is my three main properties in our auth demo project. One is our application name, second is for which profiles you are fetching the values, and third one is our cloud config server address. So let's rerun this application and check are we able to get the properties from our cloud config server. Yes, it's telling that fetching config from the server, which is located at 8088. And our application has been successfully started. Let's hit that URL and check that login detail we are getting from config server. Yes, I am refreshing and I am getting these values from our cloud config server. So this is it, guy. We are able to get the login via login URL and auth URL from cloud config server instead of our demo auth demo microservice. So this using this application, you can able to fetch all service related configuration from the cloud config server. So multiple microservices can connect to the cloud config server, and from there they can access their respective configuration. So using this technology, we are able to centralize our config server into one location, and whenever we need to change the properties, we can change at that only particular location and just restart the cloud config server, and we are able to start serving those new properties. So if you like this video, please subscribe my channel and share this video with your friends. Thank you and happy coding.